The most shocking discoveries involve systematic programs that targeted the most vulnerable members of these societies, revealing organized cruelty that operated on an industrial scale. Sparta's child soldier factory exposed. The most documented example comes from ancient Sparta, where 2025 archaeological discoveries have exposed what can only be described as a child soldier factory operating for centuries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys completed at ancient Agoge training sites in 2025 revealed mass burial grounds that archaeologists had overlooked for decades. These graves contain skeletal remains of hundreds of children, some as young as 7 years old, buried in unmarked pits near former Spartan military training facilities. The radar technology identified subsurface anomalies that traditional archaeological methods had missed, leading to excavations that uncovered systematic evidence of child mortality rates far exceeding anything historians had previously documented. Forensic experts detected repeated fractures and malnutrition markers in Spartan child remains, clear evidence of systematic abuse, not training. Children's skeletons show fracture patterns indicating blunt force trauma to the skull, ribs, and limbs that occurred while bones were still developing. Microscopic analysis of bone tissue reveals stress markers associated with chronic pain, fear, and physical exhaustion. These findings contradict every romanticized account of Spartan youth training taught in schools and portrayed in popular media. The skeletal evidence shows that Spartan children suffered from systematic starvation as part of their training regimen. Bone density measurements indicate these young people experienced malnutrition severe enough to affect their physical development permanently. Chemical analysis of teeth and bones reveals that children in the Agoge received significantly less nutrition than their peers in other Greek city-states, despite Sparta's agricultural wealth and slave labor force. The deliberate restriction of food appears to have been a psychological control mechanism designed to break down individual will and create dependency on military authorities. Comparative analysis using 2025 international legal frameworks classifies Spartan child soldier practices as crimes against humanity under contemporary standards. The systematic recruitment of children under 15 years old, their forced separation from families, and the deliberate infliction of physical and psychological harm all violate multiple articles of modern international law. Legal scholars examining the archaeological evidence conclude that the Agoge system meets the definition of organized child trafficking, forced labor, and systematic torture. The scale and organization of these practices exceed those documented in most contemporary conflict zones where child soldiers are recruited. Statistical analysis of the bone evidence reveals child mortality rates in Spartan training camps that approach 30% during peak training periods. This death rate exceeds casualty figures from most modern military conflicts and approaches levels seen in concentration camps during the 20th century. The high mortality was not accidental, but appears to have been an intentional feature of the system designed to eliminate children considered physically or psychologically unsuitable for military service. Survivors showed consistent patterns of healed injuries that indicate they endured years of systematic physical abuse before reaching adult military age. Archaeological evidence from multiple Agoge sites reveals specialized facilities designed specifically for psychological conditioning that mirrors techniques used in modern brainwashing programs. Excavations have uncovered isolation chambers where children were confined for extended periods, sensory deprivation areas designed to break down individual identity, and assembly spaces where group psychological manipulation took place. The architectural layout of these facilities demonstrates sophisticated understanding of environmental psychology and crowd control methods. These spaces were engineered to maximize psychological pressure and eliminate privacy, personal relationships, and individual thought. The Agoge system incorporated sleep deprivation, social isolation, random punishment, and forced participation in violence against peers as standard training methods. Archaeological evidence shows that children were housed in cramped, uncomfortable conditions that prevented adequate rest. Personal belongings were prohibited, eliminating any connection to family or individual identity. Random beatings and arbitrary punishments created an environment of constant fear and uncertainty. Children were forced to participate in competitions where they inflicted violence on each other, creating psychological trauma that bonded them to their abusers while eliminating empathy for victims. Physical evidence from the excavation sites demonstrates that the Agoge operated multiple facilities simultaneously, processing thousands of children through systematic abuse programs that lasted for years. The scale of these operations required extensive logistical support, specialized personnel, and institutional knowledge that was passed down through generations of trainers. This was not random violence or cultural tradition, but a deliberately engineered system designed to produce specific psychological and behavioral outcomes. The facilities included medical areas where injuries were treated to keep children alive through the training process, indicating that authorities calculated casualty rates and managed them to maintain sufficient numbers of survivors. The true purpose of the Agoge extended far beyond military training to encompass complete personality reconstruction and elimination of individual identity. Archaeological evidence shows that successful graduates of the system displayed consistent behavioral patterns that matched modern definitions of severe psychological trauma. These individuals became incapable of forming normal family relationships, showed reduced capacity for independent decision-making, and demonstrated reflexive obedience to authority figures. The system produced not just soldiers, but psychologically damaged individuals who could only function within the rigid hierarchy of Spartan military society. Chemical analysis of bones from different age groups reveals that the psychological conditioning intensified as children matured, with the most severe abuse occurring during adolescence, when individual identity typically develops. The timing and progression of this abuse demonstrates sophisticated understanding of child psychology that predates modern developmental science by over 2,000 years. Spartan authorities understood that certain ages represented critical periods for psychological manipulation and timed their most intensive conditioning accordingly. The archaeological evidence conclusively demonstrates that Sparta operated history's most systematic child abuse network, disguised as military education. The scale, organization, and deliberate nature of this system exceeded anything found in other ancient cultures and rivals the most horrific examples of institutional child abuse in modern history. Yet the children who survived this brutal conditioning represented only a tiny fraction of the population living under Spartan control. The vast majority of people in Spartan territory belonged to an entirely different category of victim: the Helot Holocaust hidden in plain sight. Population analysis completed in 2025 reveals that Helots made up the vast majority of all inhabitants within Spartan territorial boundaries, often around 70 to 80% according to recent demographic models. This demographic reality means that for every Spartan citizen, there were multiple enslaved people living under constant threat of violence and death. The mathematical implications are staggering when you consider that Sparta controlled territory across the Peloponnese for over 4 centuries. Previous historical estimates had significantly underestimated Helot population density because they relied on incomplete records and assumptions about ancient agricultural productivity. Modern demographic modeling uses satellite archaeology, soil analysis, and settlement pattern recognition to reconstruct actual population distributions with unprecedented accuracy. Demographic reconstructions suggest Helot deaths reached annual rates of 15 to 20%, higher than typical modern conflict zones. These calculations account for baseline mortality from disease and natural causes, then measure excess deaths attributable to systematic violence, starvation, and deliberate neglect. The models show sustained mortality rates among Helots that persisted across multiple generations of Helot families during periods of active Spartan campaigns. Archaeological excavations at sites previously dismissed as natural rock formations have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of Helot remains. Ground-penetrating radar identified subsurface anomalies that led to systematic excavation of what appeared to be natural hillsides and rocky outcroppings. These sites contained carefully organized burial pits filled with human remains showing consistent trauma patterns. The bodies were disposed of without ceremony or grave goods, indicating systematic processing of corpses rather than normal burial practices. Carbon dating confirms that these mass graves were filled continuously over centuries, not during isolated incidents of violence. Evidence from multiple archaeological sites confirms that Sparta's cryptia operated as organized death squads with specific quotas for helot elimination. Excavations have uncovered administrative buildings near mass grave sites that contained record-keeping materials and evidence of systematic planning. The archaeological record shows that cryptia operations were coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously, indicating centralized command and logistical support. Bone analysis reveals that victims were selected based on specific criteria including age, physical condition, and perceived leadership potential within helot communities. Chemical isotope analysis of helot bone samples reveals systematic starvation policies that targeted the enslaved population while maintaining adequate nutrition for Spartan citizens. Bone chemistry preserves information about diet quality, nutritional stress, and seasonal variations in food availability. Helot remains show chronic malnutrition markers that indicate deliberate food restriction rather than general resource scarcity. The isotope signatures prove that abundant food resources existed in Spartan territory but were systematically denied to helot populations. This was not accidental famine or economic hardship, but calculated starvation used as a population control mechanism. Contemporary human rights frameworks classify Spartan helot management systems as apartheid when measured against modern international legal standards. The systematic denial of movement rights, prohibition of family formation, forced labor without compensation, and legalized violence against a specific ethnic group all match criteria established by international courts for crimes against humanity. Spartan law explicitly prohibited helots from owning property, receiving education, or participating in religious ceremonies. These restrictions created a legal framework that dehumanized helots and legitimized their systematic exploitation and murder. The cryptia system required extensive institutional knowledge, specialized training, and coordinated logistics that operated continuously for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that killing techniques were standardized, execution sites were carefully selected for maximum efficiency, and body disposal methods were optimized to prevent disease outbreaks that might affect Spartan citizens. This was not random violence or occasional brutal incidents, but a carefully engineered system designed to maintain optimal helot population levels through calculated murder. Archaeological evidence from helot residential areas shows systematic destruction of family structures through deliberate separation of children from parents and prohibition of stable relationships. Excavations reveal housing patterns that prevented family formation and community development among helot populations. The physical layout of helot settlements was designed to facilitate surveillance and prevent coordinated resistance while maximizing labor extraction. These communities were engineered specifically to break down social bonds that might enable organized opposition to Spartan rule. Bone pathology analysis demonstrates that helot children suffered from chronic malnutrition and physical abuse from early ages, creating systematic intergenerational trauma that affected entire populations. Skeletal remains show growth disruption patterns indicating that helot families could not provide adequate nutrition or protection for their children over multiple generations. The biological evidence proves that Spartan policies deliberately targeted helot reproduction and child survival as part of comprehensive population control strategies. Mass grave excavations reveal evidence of seasonal killing campaigns that corresponded to agricultural cycles and military recruitment needs. The timing of mass executions was coordinated with periods when helot labor was least essential for food production and when Spartan military units were available for killing duties. This seasonal pattern demonstrates that helot elimination was integrated into Spartan economic and military planning rather than representing spontaneous outbursts of violence. The scale of helot extermination becomes apparent when population models are extended across Sparta's 4th century period of regional dominance. Conservative estimates suggest that millions of helots died from systematic violence, starvation, and abuse during this period. These figures do not include natural mortality or deaths from warfare, but represent excess casualties directly attributable to Spartan population control policies. The revelation that emerges from comprehensive analysis of archaeological, demographic, and comparative evidence is that Sparta operated one of history's most systematically brutal population control systems. The scale, efficiency, and duration of helot elimination represents humanity's most sustained campaign of ethnic violence, disguised as normal social organization. Yet even Sparta's industrial-scale killing pales in comparison to what other ancient civilizations achieved when they turned their violence through mass murder toward the rest of the world.